Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Murphy, and this is Allison Henry, and we are with Innovation and Impact Alliance. And we are here today to talk to educators. And by educators, we mean classroom teachers, leaders, tier two, counselors, anyone that is involved in making decisions with your SEL programming or are using it and want to have more of a voice in it. And so, one of the things we want to talk about today is if and how to determine your curriculum or program that you're using is usable and feasible for you. So, what are some of those questions that you can ask? What we mean by this is, have you considered all aspects of adoption and implementation, including the time it takes for you, the pre-work it takes, what knowledge and support do you get for the program you're using, and then does it match the actual need versus the perceived need that is happening in the classroom? And so we're going to talk a little bit about the questions that are typically asked when looking for program adoption, and then maybe the questions that we should really be asking. So, Allison, you want to talk a little bit about some of those questions that we see come up most of the time?
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting, Shanda, because I've sat on school-wide committees that are looking to adopt new curriculum, academic or social emotional learning. So I think this actually applies across the board. And I've also worked for 14 years through Responsive Classroom, helping school-wide committees and leaders choose an appropriate program. And so some of the typical questions that you hear make sense, right? So how much does it cost? Because they have to make sure they have the budget for it. Does it align with their school-wide goals? So typically committees and leaders have a reason why they want to adopt something new. And does it cover all the grades in our school? And sometimes if you're a district, you're looking for early childhood through 12. That's a little bit trickier. Sometimes you have to go with more than one program or curriculum. But, if it's an elementary school, you're making sure it covers K through 5. And if not, what are you going to do? So those are the questions that are pretty standard. They totally make sense. You have to tackle it from that perspective first. But what I think is so interesting is that when we were doing our pilot studies, like those questions didn't come up at all about what teachers were even looking for. So teachers out there listening to this, Shanda and I surveyed and worked with hundreds of teachers across the US. And although these are the typical questions, they're not the questions you all have. And so we want to talk about how you can really elevate your voice and ask the questions that matter to you. Feel empowered to say, well, wait, time out. Here are the questions I have because I am actually the person executing this. I am the person at the end of this who has to make this work.
Well, and
So
Allison, I also think that what's interesting is when we talk about social emotional learning programs, the last thing we want is something that's going to be harder to implement, right? Or stress our teachers out more, because the whole point is to work on self-regulation and self-awareness. And so if we ourselves are trying to implement these programs, the last thing we want is something that's going to stress ourselves more out, or that we're forcing into the classroom that doesn't really work like we want it to. And so I think it's kind of, ironic when we go for these kind of curriculums that the questions that need to be asked are not the ones being asked, for sure.
well, right, especially because the best way for a child to learn in the classroom is when it is being modeled by the adult or by the peer. So the more calm we are, the better self awareness and regulation we have, like you said, the better we're able to model SEL competencies for our kids. So let's kind of talk about then that first kind of question then that teachers ask, which is, what does it require as you to do to even get started? You often hear curriculums and programs say, well, it's out of the box, it's turnkey. Is it? So ask that question. Is it really? Go through the material. Is it truly out of the box? I can just press play or just open a book or just hand something out? Or does it actually require you to do a whole bunch of prep and pre-work in order for it to be out of the box? Because that is a load that can sometimes be hidden or buried, that is not upfront. So although it might sound really, really great, like, oh, I can just open the box and implement it, really look at what it requires of you. Because the whole goal is, like we were just talking about, is we don't want to add any more stress to you. We know you have to do this for non-negotiable curriculum, math and reading. Um, those are non-negotiables in a school, and you have to do the curriculum handed to you most times. For SEL, you can ask, I think, these tougher questions because it directly impacts your own SEL,
And I
right?
think we could also argue, are we overcomplicating SEL? When we were doing these surveys, we also heard that teachers were talking about how they felt like they didn't have enough confidence or prior knowledge to be able to teach SEL. And if we really sit back at educators and take a moment, yes, we do. We've lived life. We know what it takes to be, good humans, to have more self-awareness, to how to provide these tools to kids. And so are we overcomplicating that with these what are called out of the box curriculums that need a ton of build up and load up time to actually even teach? And so where can we find something that supplements what we already know and we can just add that into our typical day? And so I think that kind of goes along with this whole idea of time. And also, one of the other questions that we'll talk about too is, does it provide you education on SEL? But we would like to add to that without loads of training time on the front end that is really a lot of times not needed.
Yeah, and I mean, I can remember back to being a teacher, and we were given an SEL curriculum that seemed really great. It seemed easy. But in order to even get started with it, it was time over the summer of reading, it was professional development. And so by the time you even opened the curriculum, you had done so much training, and it really wasn't quite considerate of the time of a teacher. And we know that that's one of the barriers to implementing something is time. So if you are telling me that you want to give me some sort of education on SEL so I can be my best self, do it in a way that is short and condensed, because like Shanda just said, we have all lived life. We're all adults, even though we're probably in various stages of our SEL development. And also do it in a way that can be done in increments that are sustainable, asynchronous. We have resources at our fingertips that we can go use if we need it, but they're not required to implement it. And that's, I think, a big kind of mindset shift that providers can make, and that teachers, we can help them make, is say, is this something I have to do to use your program or curriculum, or is this something I can lean on if I need it? Those are really different.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, and that's a big piece of flexibility, right? That I know the teachers need. And I think that that's, as providers, it's got to be so overwhelming to think about what is everything that we need to be able to provide for teachers. And I think the biggest answer to that is flexibility. And I think all educators can attest to that, that something like this, especially in social emotional learning, where like you said, it's not math, it's not reading, it's not structured necessarily, nor needs to be structured necessarily. But sometimes in the moment is when SEL needs to happen. And so, are there some more flexible, unstructured options that you can use that might be bigger, part of a bigger program, but they allow for that as well? And I think that is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of goes to the other point that teachers brought up, which is this really for our age group?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we going to have to make adjustments? So going back to what a typical committee or leader will think about is, does this cover all the grades? So just because something says it covers K through 5 or 6 through 8 or K-12, teachers dig in and look at the developmental appropriateness of the content, because if you are noticing it's roughly going to cover grades, but you have to do a whole bunch of adjustments to actually fit it into your classroom, that goes back to that first point around, does it require you to do all this pre-work and prep? Really ask the hard questions of, did this provider know what they were doing in terms of making this developmentally appropriate? Does it take into consideration the environment? So a preschool, kindergarten environment is very different than a fifth grade environment. Are those taken into consideration? Is it flexible enough to go across demographics in terms of the children that you serve, the families that you serve? I remember I was a public preschool teacher in kind of metro northwest of Boston in a community with high needs and very low education. And we were given an SEL curriculum that was appropriate for elementary school. So I, as a preschool teacher, had to make a whole bunch of adaptations because, my kids were sitting for about 5 minutes, but the lessons were anywhere from 12 to 17 minutes. So off the bat, I had to go through and tear it apart. If I was on a committee to choose it, I would have flagged time as something. And the other thing too is all of the resources that were made for me to send home were at a really high reading level that I knew my families wouldn't read because they can't read at that level. It was too scary. They weren't going to ask for help. And so that was on me to take that information and parcel out just the essentials to make it appropriate for my families and then have it translated into their native language, which was Spanish. So again, that goes back to all the pre-work I have to do.
Mhm.
So teachers really look at what is being provided for you. It might be the best value, it might align to your school-wide goals, and it might cover your grade, but are you actually going to use it as is? Like how much work do you even have to do, you know?
Well, and I think we also get caught up on the selling points. A lot of times, our impact, right? This curriculum has been researched. It's supported by Castle. It has great impact, and we've got to really think through that too. As researchers, we're doing the best we can in the applied setting to research these. That does not mean it's been researched at every nuance and every level. There's things that come into research that complicate that as well, like funding and all the same things we're talking about here. And so even if it says it is supported and backed by research and that we've seen great impact, you definitely have to dive in a little further and say, okay, but for preschool, has it been tested in a preschool setting? Most of the times you'll see it hasn't because that's a tough sample to really study with. Also, one of the things that I've found recently working with teens in social emotional learning is they want to have a voice in it. What we think is working for teenagers is not necessarily what they need. We are moving so fast with technology, and what they are doing with technology is even more advanced than what we are. And so, working alongside teams to come up with what do they actually need in their program is so essential. And we don't know how much that's been studied yet or been done enough to really understand that. And so, the only way for us to learn more about that is as educators that we speak up and really say this is what we know they need, or we ask them and we know this is what they need more of. And so from the pre-K standpoint, you see that there's such a range because kids are coming in with different prior knowledge to pre-K, which I think is a really challenging sample and group. And then the high schoolers, it's just the opposite. They know what they need, and so we should be asking them.
Yep. And that's where, the whole message that Shanda and I want to give today is empowering you to really be critical of what people making decisions are putting into your classroom. Really think about the appropriateness, the load it's going to add to you, where you're going to fit it into your day. Like, do you need 20 to 30 minutes that you just don't have? Or can you kind of do it here and there? Is there in the moment, like language that you can use or how you can model something or group students? Like as teachers, we know that there's strategies we use all day that actually promote SEL, that teach kids SEL, and that you don't necessarily always need a structured lesson. So, think about when you're looking at different curriculums or programs, is there a balance of both of those? So if you needed to do a lesson and you had the time to do a lesson, you can do that. But if you need different ways to teach and have kids practice SEL throughout the day, does it also have that? Because those are the actual foundational parts of SEL, right? Is the applied work that we do with kids. So think critically about what you're being handed. Don't be afraid to ask the questions and push back on whether or not you think you can actually use this. Because if we don't speak up, we're going to run into the age-old joke of it sits on a bookshelf and collects dust because someone made a decision to give us a curriculum or program that we actually can't use, and then we're on to the next thing. You're kind of on this 3-year cycle, right? Let's break that cycle, and let's challenge providers, let's challenge leaders, let's challenge researchers. Let's, as teachers, say this is what we actually need. And so Shanda and I, kind of through our work at Innovation and Impact Alliance, that's what we do. We work with providers to help them ask these questions to make sure that what they're doing is the most usable in a classroom, and it's all based on teachers, or if they're working with teens, how do we survey teens? And Shanda, do you want to talk a little bit about the survey that we're going to be doing in the US across
Yeah.
teachers?
So we're going to be distributing a survey just to learn more about what is going on in your classroom regarding social emotional learning. What are you using? What needs do you have that aren't being met? And so we will be distributing that survey through our Substack, through our social media, and through word of mouth. But if you're interested in participating in our survey, please email us at innovationandimpactalliance@gmail.com, and we will make sure that you get the link.
All right, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you at the next video.